For the past 8 years, I have been my son's bottomless ATM, the unpaid nanny for his children, and the silent sponsor of my daughter-in-law's increasingly extravagant lifestyle. I gave unconditionally, assuming I was the glue holding our family together. That was until one Sunday evening, when they slid a meticulous Excel spreadsheet across my dining table, coldly appraising the value of my home and scheduling my transition into a nursing facility just so they could claim their inheritance early. They assumed an aging widow would quietly surrender out of the sheer fear of loneliness. But instead of shedding a single tear, I simply smiled and decided to teach them a devastatingly expensive lesson about the true meaning of boundaries. The comforting aroma of roasted rosemary chicken still lingered in the warm air of my craftsman-style home. Sunday dinners had always been a sacred tradition in my household, a time meant for deep connection and warmth. The antique mahogany dining table, which my late husband Richard and I had painstakingly restored decades ago, was beautifully set with my best porcelain plates and fine linen napkins. Yet, the cozy atmosphere evaporated in an instant the moment Audrey, my daughter-in-law, unzipped her sleek designer leather portfolio. She did not reach for the buttered carrots or the fresh rolls on her plate. Instead, with a practiced, professional smile that never quite reached her eyes, she extracted 3 color-coded spreadsheets and slid one directly toward my dinner plate. Julian and I have spent the last month evaluating the family assets. Eleanor, Audrey began, her tone carrying the crisp, sterile efficiency of a real estate closing rather than a family conversation. With property values peaking this quarter, and considering your knees aren't exactly what they used to be, it makes absolutely zero financial sense for you to keep carrying this massive 4-bedroom place all by yourself. We believe it is time to be proactive. We are ready to receive our inheritance now, while the housing market is hot, rather than dealing with the messy probate process later. I looked down at the neatly printed document. It was astonishingly thorough. She had calculated the estimated sale value of the home Richard and I had paid off 5 years before his passing. She had divided the equity to neatly clear the remaining mortgage on their oversized suburban house and to fully fund my grandchildren's prestigious private academy tuition. At the very bottom, penciled in with chilling precision, was an allocated budget for my single occupancy room at Shady Pines Senior Community. It's the cleanest transition for everyone involved, Audrey continued smoothly, tapping a perfectly manicured acrylic nail against the bottom line. You will have zero maintenance worries, and we will take over the heavy administrative burden immediately. It is a win-win. I slowly shifted my gaze to my son, Julian, the boy who used to help his father paint the porch every summer. The boy I had nurtured and protected sat completely frozen. He kept his eyes rigidly fixed on his water glass, turning it slowly against the linen napkin. He reached for a dinner roll, avoiding my gaze entirely. He did not say a single word to defend me. He simply nodded, a silent, cowardly accomplice to the division of my life while I was still breathing. But it wasn't Julian's cowardice that truly sent a shiver down my spine. It was the numbers themselves. As I scanned the spreadsheet, my eyes locked onto the exact figures listed under my certificates of deposit, my municipal bonds, and my private retirement accounts. They were accurate down to the very last cent. A cold, sickening realization washed over me. Last Thanksgiving, while I was busy preparing the turkey, I had asked Julian to fetch a specific pecan pie recipe from my study. Audrey had immediately perked up and volunteered to help him find it. I had never locked my filing cabinets. Why would I? I foolishly believed I was among family. I thought my home was a sanctuary. In a flash of painful clarity, I realized that Audrey hadn't spent those 20 minutes looking for a recipe. She had been ruthlessly auditing my life. She had meticulously rifled through my private financial statements, treating my personal sanctuary like an open vault waiting to be plundered. The audacity was suffocating. Most mothers might have exploded in rage. They might have flipped the porcelain plates, screamed at the betrayal, or wept at the profound disrespect. But my years of living had taught me that the loudest reaction is rarely the most powerful. Anger is a fleeting emotion, but calculated silence is an unyielding weapon. I did not raise my voice. I did not push the offending papers back across the mahogany wood. I looked at Audrey, whose eyes were bright with predatory anticipation, and then at my son, who looked like a hollow shadow of the man his father had raised. Slowly, deliberately. I picked up the color-coded spreadsheet. I folded it once, then twice, forming a crisp, neat square. I placed it gently beside my water glass. I offered them a calm, unreadable smile, picked up my teacup, and took a slow, steady sip. I will certainly keep these numbers in mind, I said quietly, my voice perfectly even. The silence that followed was deafening. Long after the taillights of Julian and Audrey's luxury SUV had faded into the damp suburban night, I remained seated in the quiet sanctuary of my dimly lit living room. The house, usually a source of immense comfort and warmth, felt unexpectedly heavy, weighed down by the suffocating silence of an unsaid truth. The only sound cutting through the dimness was the steady, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock standing against the hallway wall, a constant, unyielding reminder of the time that had passed, and the years I had squandered trying to buy a fragile piece that never truly existed. I did not weep. I did not rage at the breathtaking cruelty of my daughter-in-law. Many would expect a mother in my position to hurl curses at the greedy outsider, to blame the ambitious woman for corrupting her precious, naive son. It is the easiest narrative to cling to, the most comforting lie that requires zero self-reflection. But sitting there alone in the shadows, bathed in the memory of the life Richard and I had painstakingly built, I knew I could not afford the luxury of self-delusion any longer. I leaned my head against the back of the worn leather armchair, forcing myself to confront a deeply uncomfortable reality. I couldn't just blame Audrey's bottomless greed. Her audacity was staggering, yes, and her blinding entitlement was a poison that had seeped into the cracks of our family. But looking into the empty hallway, I had to swallow a profoundly bitter, jagged pill. I was the enabler who had built this monster. I was the silent architect of my own tragedy. My mind drifted back 8 years, to the agonizing days following Richard's sudden and massive heart attack. When the earth shattered beneath us, I looked at Julian, then 26 and entirely lost without his father's steady, guiding hand. The grief of losing my husband was a tidal wave that nearly drowned me. In my desperate, overwhelming need to protect the only piece of Richard I had left, I made a devastating mistake. I decided to become the universal cushion for every single one of my son's falls. When Julian struggled to make a down payment on his oversized house, I didn't advise him to budget. I quietly wrote a check. When they decided to have twins and Audrey complained about the astronomical cost of daycare, I stepped in, resigning from the book club I loved to become their full-time, unpaid nanny every Tuesday and Thursday. When they wanted to upgrade their vehicles or simply couldn't balance their monthly budget, it was always my credit card that magically smoothed things over. Whenever a hurdle appeared in Julian's life, I intercepted it before he even had to break a sweat. I had convinced myself I was being a good mother. I had confused financial enabling with unconditional maternal love. I believed that by giving them everything, I was ensuring their happiness and securing our family bond. Instead, I had accomplished the exact opposite. By removing every obstacle from Julian's path, I had robbed him of the very struggles that build a man's character. I had effectively severed his spine. The thoughtful, hard-working boy who used to mow lawns in the summer to buy his own bicycle had slowly dissolved into a passive, dependent adult who viewed his mother's existence as a limitless safety net. My blind, all-consuming maternal love had stripped him of the opportunity to grow up. And Audrey, she had simply walked through the door I had left wide open. She didn't create Julian's weakness, she merely weaponized it. Why wouldn't she view my home as a liquid asset waiting to be claimed? I had spent 8 years showing her, through my own compliant behavior, that my time, my money, and my boundaries were entirely negotiable. Her greed was the spark, certainly, but my endless, unquestioning accommodation was the dry firewood that allowed the blaze to rage out of control. A single tear finally escaped, tracing a hot path down my cheek. It was not out of sorrow for the money spent, nor for the home they tried to take, but out of profound guilt for failing my son. Richard had spent years molding Julian into a capable young man, and in my desperation to be needed, I had undone all his hard work. I wiped the tear away, my hand trembling slightly, but my resolve solidifying into something cold, clear, and unbreakable. The actions I needed to take tomorrow would be perceived by them as an act of petty, vindictive revenge. Audrey would call me a bitter old woman, lashing out in spite. Julian would feel betrayed, but from the deepest part of my soul, I knew the truth. What I was preparing to execute was not born of malice or petty vengeance. It was an act of tough love, the hardest, most agonizing, and brutal form of love a mother can give. At 34 years old, Julian was completely reliant on 2 women to manage his life, his wife through her assertive ambition, and his mother through unpaid, boundless support. If I surrendered tonight, if I let them sell my home and shuffle me away into a facility just to keep the peace, I wouldn't just be losing my independence. I would be finalizing my son's failure as a man. I had to cut the safety net, not out of anger, but out of sheer necessity. I had to let him free fall into the reality of adulthood, to force him to figure out how to stand on his own 2 feet. I had to become the villain in their narrative, so that Julian could finally become the protagonist of his own. Tomorrow morning, the era of the enabler would officially end. It was time to close the bank, lock the doors, and let the harsh, unforgiving wind of reality blow through my son's life. The crisp, cool air of Monday morning felt like a cleansing breath as I stepped out of my car and walked toward the imposing glass and steel building downtown. At exactly 9 o'clock, I walked through the heavy oak doors of Hayes & Associates. Mr. Thomas Hayes had been our trusted family attorney for nearly 4 decades. He was the man who had guided Richard and me through our earliest wills, and he was the one who had finalized Richard's estate 8 years ago. Over the years, his hair had thinned and turned a distinguished silver, but his mind remained as sharp and unyielding as a steel trap. He greeted me with a warm, familiar smile, though I could see the slight crease of concern between his brows. He knew me well enough to sense the gravity of an unscheduled, urgent meeting at the very start of the work week. I took a seat in the plush leather chair across from his expansive mahogany desk, placing my handbag neatly beside me. "It is always a pleasure to see you, Eleanor," Mr. Hayes began, folding his hands over a fresh legal pad. "But I must admit, your call yesterday sounded quite urgent. Restructuring an entire estate on such short notice is highly unusual. What exactly has prompted this?" I did not waste time with pleasantries or tearful explanations. I simply reached into my bag, retrieved the color-coded spreadsheets Audrey had so brazenly presented at dinner, and slid them across the polished wood. Mr. Hayes picked them up, adjusting his reading glasses. As his eyes scanned the precise calculations of my home's equity, my retirement accounts, and the shockingly detailed budget for a nursing home facility, his expression shifted from polite concern to quiet outrage. "This is breathtakingly arrogant," he murmured, his voice hardening into the strictly professional tone I needed. "Your current revocable living trust leaves everything unconditionally to Julian upon your passing. It also grants him immediate financial and medical power of attorney should you become incapacitated. Eleanor, this structure was built on the assumption of genuine family care. But what I am looking at here invites predatory anticipation. We need to dismantle it immediately." "I am entirely certain, Thomas," I replied, my voice steady, devoid of any hesitation. "I want a complete restructuring. Not a single penny of liquid equity, disposable capital, or real estate is to pass to Julian or Audrey directly. However, before we proceed, I need to know the risks." Mr. Hayes leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "I must warn you, Eleanor, your daughter-in-law is a highly successful real estate agent. She is aggressive, well-connected, and intimately familiar with property law and asset maneuverability. If we lock down your estate, and she realizes she has been entirely cut out, her first retaliatory strike might not be a confrontation. It might be a legal petition. She could very well petition the court for a conservatorship." He paused, letting the weight of the word settle in the quiet room. "She will claim that you are experiencing cognitive decline, that you are no longer mentally competent to make these drastic changes, and that you are making them under duress. If she convinces a judge, she could seize total control of your assets, rendering all of our work today completely void." A faint, cold smile touched my lips. I reached back into my tote bag and pulled out a thick, sealed official envelope bearing the emblem of Memorial Hospital. I slid it across the desk to join the spreadsheets. "I anticipated her playbook, Thomas," I said quietly. "At 7 o'clock this morning, I paid out of pocket for an expedited, comprehensive cognitive evaluation with Dr. Eris, a leading geriatric psychiatrist. Inside that envelope is a notarized medical certificate confirming that I am of sound mind, possessing exceptional mental acuity, and fully capable of executing complex legal and financial instruments. Any attempt Audrey makes to challenge my competency in court will be dead on arrival." Mr. Hayes opened the envelope, scanned the psychiatrist's glowing report, and let out a rare, genuine chuckle of profound admiration. Checkmate before she even realized she was playing the game. "Eleanor, absolutely bulletproof. Let's build your fortress." For the next 2 hours, we methodically dismantled the old safety net. My home, my municipal bonds, and my retirement savings were transferred into an irrevocable living trust. This was the nuclear option of estate planning. By making it irrevocable, I was legally surrendering direct ownership of the assets to the trust itself, managed by an independent corporate trustee at the bank. Under these new, ironclad terms, the house could never be sold, mortgaged, or leveraged during my lifetime. "And upon your passing, Mr. Hayes asked, his pen hovering over the final drafting clause. "The real estate will bypass them entirely," I instructed. "Upon my death, the property and all remaining liquid assets are to be donated to the City Arts Conservatory to fund a permanent scholarship program for underprivileged youth for my grandchildren. Establish a highly restricted educational fund that will pay their college tuition directly to their accredited universities once they turn 18, bypassing their parents completely." Mr. Hayes nodded, typing rapidly to finalize the documents. He printed out the quitclaim deed, the legal instrument that formally transferred the title of my home into the newly established irrevocable trust. I picked up the heavy brass pen and signed my name with a fluid, unhesitating hand. "I am submitting the paperwork via the county's e-filing system right now, Mr. Hayes explained, clicking his mouse, the printer whirred, producing a page with a digital timestamp. "There, we have the electronic receipt. Even though the county office will take weeks to process the physical deed, your signature is legally binding as of this exact second. The property is officially out of their reach." I let out a long breath, feeling an invisible, suffocating weight lift from my shoulders. "There is one final matter," I said. "The power of attorney." Mr. Hayes pulled up the remaining forms. "I have drafted the revocation of Julian's financial authority, transferring it to an independent fiduciary firm. But regarding the durable medical power of attorney, your healthcare proxy, who shall I list? It must be a specific individual. Bypassing your only next of kin for a medical proxy is an incredibly severe measure." I looked out the large window at the bustling city below, feeling the lingering chill of the previous night's revelations hardening my resolve. I thought of Julian, sitting silently at the dinner table, chewing his bread while his wife casually priced my transition into a facility. I thought of how easily he would capitulate to her demands if I were ever lying in a hospital bed, attached to a ventilator. "I am assigning full medical authority to Clara, my closest friend of 40 years, I instructed. "She has my advance directives." Mr. Hayes paused, looking up at me over the rim of his glasses. The weight of that decision hung heavily in the room. "Are you entirely sure, Eleanor?" I looked directly into my lawyer's eyes. My voice was quiet, stripped of all emotion, carrying only the absolute, bone-chilling truth. "Mr. Hayes, if I am ever incapacitated, I need an advocate who will fight for my life. I would rather hand the responsibility of my existence to an old friend than place my fate in the hands of a son who views his mother's heartbeat as an inconvenience delaying his payday." Mr. Hayes held my gaze for a long moment. He didn't offer any empty platitudes or arguments. He simply nodded respectfully, stamped the final golden notary seal on the revocation documents, and filed them away. The legal fortress was complete. Tuesday morning dawned with an unapologetic, crisp clarity. I poured a cup of my favorite dark roast coffee and sat at the kitchen island, opening my laptop. For 8 years, this very spot had served as the unofficial command center for managing Julian and Audrey's lives. Today, it would serve a drastically different purpose. It was time to systematically dismantle the financial life support system that had kept my 34-year-old son in a state of perpetual, entitled adolescence. First on my agenda were the everyday conveniences I had silently funded for nearly a decade. I pulled up the website for my telecommunications provider. I had maintained a premium family plan since Julian was in college, absorbing the exorbitant costs of their unlimited data usage and yearly smartphone upgrades without a single complaint. I dialed customer service and, with a calm, unwavering voice, instructed the representative to immediately remove Julian and Audrey's phone lines from my primary account. They were to be migrated to completely separate billing cycles. My financial responsibility for their communication was permanently terminated. Next, I turned my attention to the elite landscaping service that meticulously maintained their sprawling suburban home every month. The hefty invoice for mowing their lawn and trimming Audrey's pristine hydrangeas was automatically drafted from my Platinum credit card. I called the dispatcher and canceled the recurring service entirely. When the confused clerk asked if I wanted to leave a forwarding billing address for the homeowners, I simply replied that they would need to establish their own payment method moving forward. If Audrey wanted a manicured lawn to impress her neighborhood association, Julian could finally learn how to start a lawnmower. These were the minor leaks. Now, it was time to address the gaping vulnerability, the joint bank account. When Julian entered college 16 years ago, I proudly walked him into our local bank to open a joint checking and savings account. It was originally intended to be a practical safety net for textbook expenses and emergency car repairs. However, long after he graduated, married, and supposedly became a self-sufficient adult, that account remained highly active. Audrey and Julian had seamlessly transformed it into their personal slush fund. Whenever their extravagant lifestyle outpaced their income, Julian would quietly swipe the debit card linked to that account. Every month, like clockwork, I would transfer funds from my pension to replenish it, ensuring he never had to face the anxiety of a low balance. My initial instinct on Sunday night had been to call the bank and close the account entirely. However, my consultation with Mr. Hayes reminded me of a crucial complication within the American banking system: permanently closing a joint account. Holding substantial funds often requires the physical signatures or formal digital consent of both primary account holders to prevent liability disputes. If I initiated a closure request, the bank would immediately notify Julian. He would panic, involve Audrey, and drag the process out into a messy, protracted confrontation. I had no desire to entertain. I did not need his permission to protect my own money. I didn't need to close the account to render it completely useless. I just needed to drain it. Under standard banking laws, as a joint account holder, I had uninhibited, unilateral access to all the funds. I navigated to the online transfer portal and looked at the healthy five-figure balance, every single cent of which had been deposited by me. Without a flicker of hesitation, I executed a wire transfer, moving 100% of those funds directly into a highly secure, solo checking account I had opened under my own name the previous day. I watched the screen refresh. The available balance in the joint account updated instantly. It read a flawless, unforgiving $0. I didn't close the account. I bled it dry, leaving behind an empty shell. I closed my laptop and began watering my African violets, waiting for the inevitable impact. The invisible punishment struck precisely at 1:15 in the afternoon. My cell phone vibrated violently against the granite countertop. It was a text message from Julian. I didn't open it immediately. Instead, I poured a cup of chamomile tea, savoring the peaceful silence before picking up the device. The frantic nature of his messages painted a profoundly humiliating picture. Julian had casually mentioned on Sunday that he was hosting a crucial lunch meeting with a prospective executive client on Tuesday at an upscale downtown steakhouse. He always insisted on paying to project an image of effortless success. I could vividly picture the scene: the polished waiter presenting the leather checkbook, Julian confidently sliding the joint debit card across the white tablecloth, continuing his charming conversation. Then, the waiter returning moments later, leaning in with a discreet, apologetic whisper. "I'm terribly sorry, sir, but your card has been declined." I opened the messages. Julian, 1:12 p.m. "Mom, what is going on with the bank?" Julian, 1:13 p.m. "My card just got declined at Gibson's Steakhouse, in front of the regional director." Julian, 1:14 p.m. "I checked the app. The joint balance says 0. Did we get hacked? Please transfer some funds immediately so I can pay this bill. This is humiliating. Everyone is staring at me." I could almost see the color draining from his face as he sat trapped in a high-end restaurant, staring at a declined receipt while a wealthy client watched him fumble in embarrassment. For 34 years, whenever Julian fell, I had rushed in with a safety net. Today, he hit the cold, hard concrete. I did not call him back to offer comfort. I did not rush to transfer money to save his fragile pride. I did not offer an emotional explanation for his public embarrassment. I simply placed my teacup on the saucer, tapped the screen, and typed a brief, painfully clear reply. Eleanor, 1:18 p.m. "The account wasn't hacked. Julian, I have simply separated our finances. The joint account is empty. From this day forward, you will need to arrange and pay for your own meals. Good luck with your client." I pressed send, silenced my phone, and slipped it into my pocket. The umbilical cord was finally severed, and the silence in my kitchen felt incredibly light. The silent financial blow I had delivered to Julian during his lunch meeting was merely the opening act of my Tuesday restructuring. While he was likely still hyperventilating in the lobby of a downtown steakhouse, frantically applying for a new credit card to cover his humiliating tab, I turned my attention to the most significant commitment I had made to their household for 3 exhausting years. My Tuesday and Thursday afternoons had been entirely hijacked by the unrelenting demands of their children. Instead of enjoying my hard-earned retirement, I had functioned as Audrey's personal, unpaid chauffeur and nanny. I would navigate heavy traffic, sit in the chaotic elementary school pickup line, ferry my 7-year-old twin grandchildren back to my house, supervise their homework, and prepare their dinner. I performed this grueling routine without a single word of complaint, allowing Audrey to dedicate her afternoons to hosting lucrative open houses without ever having to sacrifice a dime for professional childcare. She viewed my time as an endless resource at her absolute disposal. It was time she learned its true market value. At exactly 1:30 p.m., I did not reach for my car keys. Instead, I picked up my landline and dialed the main administrative office of the Twins Elementary School. I identified myself to the school secretary and requested an immediate modification to my grandchildren's emergency files. "Good afternoon. I am currently listed on the authorized daily pickup roster for the Twins," I stated calmly, making sure my enunciation was perfectly clear. Effective immediately, I am to be completely removed from that list. Under no circumstances am I legally authorized to retrieve them from school property going forward. The responsibility for their dismissal falls entirely on their biological parents. Mrs. Higgins paused, clearly surprised, but the sound of her keyboard clicking echoed over the line. "Certainly. Eleanor, I will update the system right now. Have the parents made alternative arrangements for today's dismissal?" That is entirely up to their mother to manage, I replied calmly. Have a wonderful afternoon. I hung up the phone. I did not send a text message to Audrey to give her a polite warning when they had shoved those predatory spreadsheets across my dining table on Sunday. They hadn't offered me the courtesy of a warning before attempting to liquidate my home. I was simply returning their administrative efficiency. I walked into my sunlit kitchen, tied a linen apron around my waist, and began organizing my painting supplies. I had recently enrolled in an afternoon watercolor workshop, a small passion I had postponed for years because it conflicted with Audrey's schedule. The trap was set, perfectly synchronized with the harsh realities of the American public school system and its unforgiving child welfare laws. The bomb detonated exactly at 3:15 p.m., the moment the final school bell rang. I knew Audrey's schedule intimately. She had bragged at dinner on Sunday about an exclusive, private walkthrough. She was hosting on Tuesday afternoon for a wealthy VIP couple looking to purchase a multi-million-dollar lakeside estate. She had planned to spend hours charming them, perfectly secure in the knowledge that her mother-in-law was performing her domestic duties for free. What she did not anticipate was the unforgiving rigidity of school district policies. When 3:30 p.m. arrived and no authorized guardian appeared, the twins were escorted directly to the principal's office. Public schools do not casually hold children indefinitely, nor do they automatically enroll them in paid aftercare programs without a swiped credit card. At 3:45 p.m., Audrey's cell phone rang in the middle of her immaculate presentation. On the other end of the line was the school's stern administrative principal delivering a terrifying legal ultimatum. Mrs. Audrey, your mother-in-law formally removed herself from the authorized pickup roster earlier today. There is currently no legally approved adult on the premises to claim your children. By state law, we cannot hold them past 4:15 p.m. If you or your husband do not arrive to take custody of these minors in the next 30 minutes, we are legally mandated to contact the police and dispatch Child Protective Services, CPS, to report an incident of child abandonment. The sheer terror of facing a CPS investigation over a childcare dispute shattered Audrey's carefully curated professional facade in an instant. The threat of CPS involvement is a nightmare for any parent in America. She was forced to abandon her wealthy clients in the middle of a massive property tour, offering a frantic, mortifyingly unprofessional apology as she sprinted to her luxury SUV. She drove across town in a blind panic, terrified of arriving to find a police cruiser parked in front of the school. When she finally burst through the school's double doors, breathless and deeply humiliated, the principal did not offer sympathy to prevent CPS from being called. She was forced to pull out her credit card right there in the hallway and pay an immediate, non-refundable $800 penalty fee for emergency childcare registration. At 4:30 p.m., my cell phone began to ring. The caller ID flashed Audrey's name. I let it ring 3 times before answering on speakerphone while I calmly took a sip of my freshly brewed Earl Grey tea. "Eleanor!" Audrey shrieked, her voice shrill, breathless, and trembling with unprecedented rage. "Are you out of your mind? The school just threatened to call Child Protective Services on me. I had to abandon a $3 million showing. I had to pay $800. Why didn't you pick them up? Why didn't you give me any warning?" I placed my teacup on its saucer, completely unbothered by her hysterical volume. "I am currently preparing for my watercolor painting class, Audrey," I replied, my tone smooth, unhurried, and devoid of any apology. "My time is no longer a free commodity for you to exploit. If you want to build your real estate empire, you will need to fund your own childcare. It is time for you and Julian to finally act like parents. Before she could scream another word of accusation, I ended the call. The canvas of my new life was entirely blank, ready for whatever I chose to create. Wednesday morning arrived with a crisp, refreshing breeze that swept away the lingering tension of the past 2 days. The financial umbilical cord had been decisively severed, and the free childcare safety net had been dramatically removed. However, true liberation required more than just cutting legal and financial ties. It was time to address the physical violations of my sanctuary. It was time to physically reclaim my home. For the past few years, as Audrey's luxury real estate career blossomed, she had slowly and insidiously colonized my house. She specialized in staging properties for high-end buyers, a lucrative tactic that required a massive, rotating inventory of decorative items. Instead of paying for a commercial storage unit like a responsible business owner, she had casually commandeered my spacious guest bedroom and a corner of my formal living room. It began innocently enough, a few boxes of throw pillows left behind after a weekend visit. But because I had repeatedly prioritized family harmony over my own boundaries, that small concession had ballooned into a chaotic, suffocating invasion. My guest room was completely choked with towering, heavy plastic tubs. They were filled to the brim with artificial fiddle-leaf fig trees, bundles of heavy velvet curtains, rolled-up area rugs, and boxes of generic, mass-produced abstract art she used to artificially warm up empty houses. She treated my home with the casual, dismissive indifference of a rented warehouse, dumping her inventory wherever she pleased. I did not call Julian to politely request that he come and remove his wife's belongings. I had learned the hard way that negotiating with unyielding entitlement only invites further manipulation and arguments. Instead, after finishing my morning coffee, I rolled up my sleeves, tied my hair back, and began the heavy lifting myself. I spent the entirety of Wednesday systematically clearing out the space. I carried every single plastic bin, every rolled Persian rug, and every piece of framed artwork out of the guest room and the living room. It was grueling, physical labor, but with every heavy box I carried, my spirit felt inexplicably lighter. I was not just moving plastic, I was physically removing the suffocating weight of their entitlement from my life. I did not throw her expensive staging equipment onto the wet driveway to be ruined by the elements. I simply stacked the massive mountain of inventory neatly on the side porch, protected securely under the heavy wooden awning. By Thursday morning, with the interior clutter completely eradicated, I turned my attention to the most critical vulnerability of all, physical access. For 8 long years, Julian and Audrey had possessed the 4-digit access code to the electronic keypad on my front door. They had treated my home like a public concourse. They had developed a deeply intrusive habit of walking into my kitchen unannounced at any hour of the day or night to grab a tool, drop off their dry cleaning, or rummage through my refrigerator as if they still paid the grocery bill. They never knocked. They simply assumed they had an unquestionable, permanent right to cross my threshold. I called a highly rated local locksmith who arrived promptly at 10 o'clock. I instructed him to remove the old, compromised keypad from the front door entirely. In its place, he installed a state-of-the-art, heavy-duty electronic deadbolt mechanism, complete with a reinforced strike plate for maximum security. He did the same for the side entrance leading from the garage. I stood in the entryway and carefully programmed a new, highly complex security code into the gleaming brass pad. I did not share this combination with anyone. The privilege of unrestricted entry was permanently revoked. When the locksmith packed up his tools and handed me the final invoice, I locked the heavy deadbolt from the inside and listened to the solid, metallic click slide firmly into place. The physical boundary was now impenetrable. Thursday evening descended softly. Wrapping the neighborhood in a quiet, comforting twilight, I did not turn on the television to distract myself. I did not check my phone for frantic messages or angry voicemails. Instead, I walked into my beautifully restored, completely empty living room. I lit a thick vanilla and sandalwood candle, placing it on the antique coffee table. I poured myself a single glass of robust red wine and walked over to the vintage record player Richard had bought for my 50th anniversary. I carefully set the needle down on an old vinyl record, letting the smooth, velvety notes of classic jazz fill the open air. I sank deeply into my favorite armchair, pulled a soft woven blanket over my knees, and looked around. For the first time in 8 years, my home was silent. It was a profound, healing quiet. There were no sudden, unannounced visits disrupting my evening. There were no stressful phone calls demanding emergency funds or impromptu babysitting. There were no plastic storage tubs crowding my vision. There was no sound of Julian lazily rummaging through my pantry, and no Audrey pacing the floor complaining about her clients. The air was still, heavy with peace and the fragrant scent of sandalwood. The chaotic chapter of being a convenient doormat had officially closed. The house finally felt like an impregnable sanctuary. It was completely, undeniably, and exclusively mine. The boundaries had been set, and my soul was finally at rest. Friday morning arrived wrapped in dark clouds. Torrential rain lashed against my windows. I sat calmly nursing a cup of tea. According to Mr. Hayes's office, the legal packets containing the irrevocable trust documents, disinheritance notice, and revocation of powers of attorney had been signed for at Julian's residence at 9:45 a.m. At 10:30 a.m., the crunch of tires tearing up the wet gravel cut through the rain. I watched Audrey's SUV slam into park. Audrey stormed out without an umbrella, clutching the envelope of documents like a weapon. Julian followed closely behind her, shoulders hunched, looking miserable. Audrey marched aggressively up the walkway. She stomped to my entrance, furiously jabbing the old code into the new electronic keypad. When the lock flashed red and emitted an error beep, her frustration boiled over. She began pounding violently against the heavy oak door. "Eleanor, open this door right now!" Audrey screamed. "Explain this immediately!" Julian stood on the lower step, battered by freezing rain. He didn't stop his wife. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on his shoes. A pathetic portrait of a man hiding behind the aggressive ambition of a woman. I took a steadying breath and walked deliberately into the entryway. I turned the new deadbolt with a loud click and pulled the heavy inner door open. However, I kept the reinforced glass storm door securely locked between us. Audrey slammed her palm against the wet glass. "Call Thomas Hayes right now and undo this," Audrey shrieked. "An irrevocable trust? You stripped Julian of his proxy? You cannot destroy our future out of pure spite." I stood perfectly straight. "I didn't ruin your future, Audrey," I replied, projecting clearly through the glass. "I simply stopped financing it. My home and savings were never an inheritance waiting for your early collection." I shifted my gaze directly to the man standing helplessly in the rain. "Julian," I commanded, ringing out with bone-chilling authority. He flinched visibly, reluctantly raising his head. "Your father spent decades working tirelessly to raise a strong man," I said. "But looking at you today, I only see a hollow shadow. On Sunday, you allowed your wife to casually put a price tag on my life while my heart was still beating. And you were so cowardly you did not have the spine to utter a single syllable to defend your mother." Julian opened his mouth, desperately looking at his wife, but the weight of my disappointment crushed his excuses. "This boundary I have drawn is not a spiteful punishment," I continued, boring relentlessly into his soul. "It is my final attempt to force you to grow up. The bank is closed. The safety net is gone. You are 34 years old. It is time to learn how to stand on your own 2 feet." The truth of my words shattered the entitled reality they had lived in for 8 years. Julian's jaw trembled. Hot tears mingled with the cold rain on his cheeks. His self-respect was utterly broken by the agonizing truth of his own profound failure as a man. Without a word, Julian slowly turned away. His shoulders sagged with the unbearable weight of reality. He walked mechanically over to the dry side of the porch, bent down, and silently picked up 2 of the heavy plastic storage tubs filled with Audrey's staging equipment. Audrey stared at him in breathless disbelief. Her weapon had been disarmed. Realizing she had definitively lost control, she snapped her mouth shut, turned on her heel, and marched silently back to the car. I pulled the inner oak door shut and turned the deadbolt with a solid click. The heavy thud of their trunk slamming shut echoed through the damp morning air, followed by their rapid departure. For the first time in 8 exhausting years, the suffocating weight of their toxic demands left with them. The storm began to ease, softening into a gentle drizzle. A brilliant beam of sunlight pierced through the gloom, illuminating my hallway. The silence within the house felt expansive and brilliantly brimming with possibility. A profound sense of tranquility washed over my soul. I walked to my desk and opened my planner. I picked up my pen and began to fill the empty spaces with a life that finally belonged entirely to me. Tuesday, pottery class. Wednesday, volunteer orientation. Thursday, hosting my book club. The twilight years of a mother's life are not merely a dreary waiting room for death. These years are meant to be the most vibrant, fiercely independent chapter of our absolute freedom. By cutting the umbilical cord, I was giving Julian the necessity to become a self-reliant man. Sometimes, the greatest love a mother can show is the agonizing courage to let them fall, so they can learn how to stand. Dear friends, unconditional love for families is undeniably priceless, but it should never mean sacrificing yourself to become a doormat. Setting unyielding boundaries with your flesh and blood is an agonizing challenge. What do you think about Eleanor's decision? Is this ruthlessness truly the only medicine strong enough to wake Julian up? Have you had to draw a heartbreaking boundary with someone you love? Share your stories in the comments below. If you found empathy or healing in today's story, please hit the like button and subscribe. Thank you for listening. Protect your peace, and I will see you next time.